In Mongolia, sometime in the late 12th century, a blizzard swept across the open steppe. The wind erased tracks almost as quickly as they were made. Temperatures plunged, visibility vanished into white. Yet one rider pushed forward into the storm, alone, searching, not for shelter, but for animals. Somewhere ahead, barely visible through the blowing snow, moved vast herds of Dzeren, known in English as the Mongolian Gazelle. If he could find them, he could drive them home, provide for his household, prove his loyalty, secure his place in a new family. That rider was Shigi Kutuku, a man more famous as the adopted son of Genghis Khan. And the animals he pursued belonged to a lineage that still races across the grasslands today, a lineage known as Procapra. This account of Shigi Kutuku is recorded in the Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving work written in a Mongolic language. Written for the Mongol royal family, its inclusion of the storm-bound hunt tells us something important. These were not random animals. They were central to survival on the steppe. Winters like that have never been rare in Mongolia. The landscape remains vast, exposed, and unforgiving. And yet the descendants of those same herds still move across it today. To understand how, we need to step back from the storm and look more closely at the lineage these animals belong to. Dzeren are antelopes within the family Bovidae, relatives of cattle, sheep, and goats. Despite their English name, they are not members of the genus Gazelle. Instead, they belong to a distinct Central Asian lineage, Procapra. The genus contains 3 living species, all adapted to open country. At first glance, they appear remarkably similar, lightly built antelopes of grassland and plateau. What makes the genus particularly compelling is not how different these animals look, but how differently they live. The Mongolian gazelle can gather in immense herds. Groups of 20 or 30 are common, but aggregations of several thousand are not unusual. The Tibetan gazelle, by contrast, tends to form small family groups, rarely more than 10 individuals. The third species, Przewalski's gazelle, falls somewhere between these extremes. Today, its herds are small, often fewer than a dozen animals, though historical accounts suggest that when it was more numerous, it too formed far larger herds. These differences raise an interesting question. If these antelopes share a recent common ancestor, a broadly similar body plan, and fairly similar habitat, why have they adopted such different social strategies? To answer that, we need to look at each species in turn. Of the 3 species, it is the Dzeren, Procapra gutturosa, that most closely matches the image of the storm-bound herds described in Mongol history. Despite the English name, Mongolian gazelle, they are neither true gazelles nor confined to Mongolia. On the sweeping Central Asian steppe, these antelopes recognize no political borders. Small populations extend into Russia and northern China, though the overwhelming majority roam eastern Mongolia, where the grasslands still stretch in near unbroken continuity. Today, they remain one of the most numerous large mammals on the Eurasian steppe. In favourable years, their population has been estimated in the millions, a scale increasingly rare among wild ungulates. At first glance, the Dzeren appears unremarkable, a lightly built antelope, sandy in colour, with slender limbs and gently curved ridged horns in the males. The coat shifts subtly with the seasons, shorter and sleeker in summer, thicker and paler as winter approaches. There are no extravagant facial markings, no towering horns, no obvious anatomical spectacle. But its true adaptation is not anatomical novelty, it is scale. The eastern Mongolian steppe is vast, treeless and exposed. Rainfall is low and highly variable. Some summers bring bursts of productivity, others remain dry and sparse. Winter temperatures plunge far below freezing, and winds sweep unhindered across open ground. The greatest danger is not cold alone, but unpredictability. Snow may fall lightly and disperse quickly, or it may accumulate, drift and refreeze into a crust that seals vegetation beneath ice. In severe winters, livestock perish in great numbers. Wild herbivores face the same constraint. Grass inaccessible beneath snow is grass that may as well not exist. In such an environment, permanence is a liability. A strategy based on defending territory, memorizing fixed seasonal routes, or remaining loyal to a specific patch of ground would invite catastrophe when conditions shift. So instead, Dzeren move. Their bodies reflect the strategy of perpetual adjustment. Dzeren are lightly framed, reducing the energetic cost of sustained locomotion. Their limbs are long and slender, built not for explosive sprinting alone, but for efficient travel across firm, open terrain. The hooves are narrow, suited to hard steppe soils rather than deep forest or marsh. Their physiology supports endurance. Their survival, however, depends on movement. As autumn advances, the coat thickens, guard hairs lengthen, dense underfur develops, trapping insulating air against the skin. Fat reserves accumulate beneath the hide and around internal organs during productive months, providing both insulation and an energy buffer when food becomes scarce. Dzeren do not defend permanent territories. They exist within a shifting social network that expands and contracts according to conditions. At times, small bands of 20 or 30 individuals graze quietly across the plains. At other moments, especially when resources concentrate or during seasonal transitions, these bands merge into aggregations of hundreds, even thousands. Historical accounts and modern aerial surveys alike describe gatherings that stretch toward the horizon. These are not rigid migrations along narrow corridors between fixed seasonal ranges. Rather, they are broad redistributions across hundreds of kilometers, responding to rainfall patterns, vegetation growth, and snow depth, factors that may change year to year. The herd is not merely protection, it is information. Many eyes scan for predators, wolves in particular, reducing individual risk. But beyond vigilance, each individual samples the landscape. When forage quality declines, subtle shifts ripple outward. Movement spreads through the group. In this way, herd dynamics become a distributed sensing system, allowing the population to track a constantly changing mosaic of opportunity and scarcity. Scale magnifies this effect. A lone antelope, searching randomly across the steppe, faces low odds of locating favorable ground during harsh conditions. A population numbering in the hundreds of thousands can fragment, explore, and reconverge, vastly increasing the probability that some portion will encounter windswept ridges or lightly snow-covered pasture. Reproduction is synchronized with environmental rhythms. Calving occurs within a narrow seasonal window in early summer. For a brief period, the steppe fills with newborns. This synchrony overwhelms predators through sheer numbers, a strategy known as predator swamping. Most vulnerable young are taken quickly, but the majority survive simply because there are too many to consume. Abundance, timing, and movement work together. The blizzard that once drove a mounted rider across the steppe was not an anomaly. It was part of a recurring climatic pattern that has shaped this species for millennia. Storms compress the habitable landscape. Snow reorganizes pasture. Cold tests endurance. Yet, for the Dzeren, survival has never meant resisting the storm in place. It has meant moving ahead of it. Their answer to volatility is not dramatic anatomical extravagance, but nobility at scale. A population vast enough and flexible enough to absorb environmental shock through redistribution. As long as the steppe remains open, the herds can shift, fragment, and reform, flowing across the grassland in patterns older than empires. And it is this living tide of movement that links the modern Dzeren to the storm-bound herds of history. If the Dzeren roams the lowland expanses of the steppe, the goer, sometimes known as the Tibetan gazelle, Procapra picticordata, lives at the opposite extreme, high, arid, and cold. Above 3,000 meters, where oxygen thins and temperatures plunge even in summer, these antelopes cling to the vast Tibetan plateau, an environment as unforgiving as the Mongolian steppe, but shaped by altitude rather than endless openness. At first glance, goer resemble miniature Dzeren, sandy coats, slender limbs, and gently curved horns in the males. Their most distinctive feature is a heart-shaped white patch on their rump, but a closer look reveals adaptations shaped by the plateau's thin air and sparse vegetation. Their bodies are smaller and lighter, reducing oxygen demand and lowering energetic requirements in a habitat where food is rare and winters linger long. Where Dzeren travel in immense shifting aggregations, goer live in far smaller groups. Family units rarely exceed 10 individuals, and even temporary herds remain modest in size. Herding here is not about broad-scale redistribution. It is about local survival, vigilance, and maintaining access to scarce pasture. Predation pressure, primarily from wolves, shapes spacing and movement, but mobility is limited by the fragmented mountainous terrain. Unlike the Dzeren, Goa cannot simply escape storms by traversing hundreds of kilometers. The plateau constrains them, and adaptation means endurance rather than scale. Seasonal change is crucial. Winters are long and harsh. Snow can accumulate in deep drifts, and vegetation becomes a patchwork of sparse grasses and herbs. Goa rely on a combination of fat reserves and their dense winter coat to endure the cold, but movement is more strategic than fluid. Trails follow ridgelines and valleys where grazing remains accessible. Calving is timed for the brief alpine summer, allowing newborns a window of forage abundance, and predators are again confronted with a concentrated pulse of vulnerability, though on a far smaller scale than Dzeren herds. The Goa's restricted range and smaller numbers mean their survival is more precarious. Classified as near threatened by the IUCN, their populations have declined in parts of their range due to habitat encroachment, fencing, and competition with domestic livestock. Yet within the plateau's remoter expanses, they persist, a testament to endurance and specialization rather than mass movement. Here, the story of mobility shifts. Where the Dzeren embodies fluidity and breadth, the Goa demonstrates precision and efficiency. Both species share a lineage, both endure cold and variability, but each solves the challenges of open landscapes differently. One spreads across hundreds of kilometers in response to climate. The other navigates extreme altitudes with finely tuned local knowledge. In this contrast, the Procapra genus reveals the flexibility of survival strategies, whether roaming endlessly across the lowlands or threading carefully through the high plateaus. These antelopes illustrate how evolution tailors life to the demands of its environment, and how movement, whether at scale or within constrained corridors, remains central to survival. If Dzeren roam the open steppe in vast fluid herds, and Goa thread carefully across high-altitude plateaus, the Przewalski's gazelle, Procapra przewalski, occupies the narrowest ecological niche of the genus. Once widespread across the grasslands surrounding the Qinghai Lake Basin and beyond, this species now survives in small, fragmented populations confined to pockets of grassland in the northeast of the Qinghai province in China. At first glance, the Przewalski's gazelle resembles its relatives. Sandy brown coat, slender frame, modestly curved horns in the males. Its body is slightly smaller than the Dzeren, reflecting adaptation to limited forage and a historically more arid habitat. Its winter coat is dense, providing insulation against cold, dry winds, and its subtle coloration helps it blend into the grasses and saline flats of its restricted range. Social behavior is strikingly different from the other Procapra. Today, groups rarely exceed a handful of individuals. These small aggregations are often observed as single-family units with loose, temporary gatherings when food is plentiful. But this does not necessarily reflect ancestral behavior. Historical accounts suggest that when Przewalski's gazelle were more numerous, they too may have formed larger herds, similar in principle to the Dzeren. Their current small group size is at least partly a consequence of population collapse and habitat fragmentation, rather than an evolved preference for isolation. This highlights the behavioral flexibility inherent in Procapra. Przewalski's gazelles were once capable of assembling in substantial herds across the Qinghai grasslands, but once conditions changed and their numbers lessened, those aggregations became impossible. What we observe today, small, scattered family groups, reflects a society reshaped by demographic reality. Mobility is now highly constrained. Przewalski's gazelles navigate fragmented landscapes. Fences, roads, and settlements limit movement, restricting access to pasture and water. Survival relies on intimate local knowledge, grazing on patches that persist through harsh winters and dry summers, timing reproduction carefully with the short alpine growing season, and remaining alert to predators such as wolves. Reproduction produces few offspring, making population recovery slow and fragile. The species conservation status underscores this vulnerability. Once widespread, Przewalski's gazelle is now classified as endangered by the IUCN. Fewer than 2,000 individuals remain, scattered across reserves, nature preserves, and unprotected grasslands. Their survival depends not on abundance, but on continuity and connectivity of habitat. the ability to move freely within the remaining patches. In ecological terms, Przewalski's gazelle represents the most constrained of its lineage. Unlike Dzeren, whose strategy is to spread risk across vast space, or Goa, which rely on altitude and precision, this species survives through vigilance, timing, and small-scale adaptability. It is a living relic, a reminder of the once expansive Procapra range, and a testament to resilience in the face of both environmental and human pressures. Here, at the edge of survival, the contrast within the genus becomes clear, from Dzeren's sweeping migrations to Goa's precise altitude navigation, and finally to the Przewalski gazelle's small, fragile refuges. Procapra illustrates the spectrum of strategies life can adopt to endure cold, aridity, and unpredictability. And in the story of Przewalski's gazelle, we glimpse the consequences when ecological constraints interact with human impact. Across Procapra, survival has always depended on flexibility, the ability to redistribute across space as conditions change. But flexibility requires room. For the Dzeren, that room once stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Their strategy, mass movement in response to drought and blizzard, only functions when the steppe remains permeable. Railways, border fencing, and expanding agriculture do not eliminate habitat outright, they divide it. Even low barriers can redirect or halt tens of thousands of animals at the moment where movement matters most. On the Tibetan Plateau, the Goa operates at a smaller scale, but faces the same constraint. Fragmentation from fencing and pasture conversion isolates high-altitude basins that were once loosely connected. For a species living in small groups, separation can quickly erode resilience. For Przewalski's gazelle, the consequences are most acute. Reduced to a fraction of its former range around the Qinghai Lake, its survival now depends on reconnecting subpopulations and preventing further isolation. Here, fragmentation is not an inconvenience, it is an existential risk. The contrast across the genus is one of scale, not principle. One species still moves in the hundreds of thousands, one persists across a remote plateau, one survives in scattered remnants. Yet all depend on landscapes structured by wind, snow, and rainfall. Forces that shift but do not build walls. Modern infrastructure does. Effective conservation for Procapra is therefore less about containment and more about continuity. Designing railways with underpasses, modifying fencing, maintaining corridors, monitoring not only abundance but connectivity. Because for these antelopes, survival is not a matter of fortification, it is a matter of flow. Long before railways crossed the steppe, before borders hardened into lines on maps, humans moved across these grasslands much as the antelopes did, following water, pasture, and season. Humans and the antelopes of Procapra have long shared this land. On the eastern steppe, the great herds of Dzeren would have been a familiar sight to mounted riders of the Mongol Empire. Historical accounts describe vast grasslands, alive with game. Whether pursued for meat, hides, or simply encountered during long campaigns, these animals formed part of the ecological background of the empire. The storm-bound rider from our opening scene was not crossing an empty wilderness. He rode through a living system in motion. Horses, livestock, wild herds, all responding to the same wind, the same snow, the same shifting mosaic of pasture. But even long before the Mongol Empire, archaeological evidence suggests that these animals were important for humans. The ancestors of Przewalski's gazelle were hunted around the Qinghai Lake basin for thousands of years. Stone tools and faunal remains testify to a long relationship between people and small fleet-footed ungulates of the plateau. For early communities, these animals were not symbols or conservation concerns, they were sustenance. For most of that shared history, human technology amplified mobility rather than restricting it. Horses extended range, felt tents collapsed and moved, herds of sheep and goats grazed and shifted. But over the last century, the structure of the landscape has changed. Humans tending towards staying in one place, expanding agriculture, permanent settlements, and transportation infrastructure have introduced barriers that storms never did. A blizzard passes, snow melts, grass regrows, a fence remains. For species like the Dzeren, whose survival depends on large-scale redistribution, even low-wire fencing can redirect or fragment movement. For Goa, grazing allotments and pasture enclosures subdivide highland basins. For Przewalski's gazelle, roads and development around Qinghai Lake compressed what was once a broader range into scattered refuges. The difference is not simply human presence, it is permanence. Yet the relationship is not solely one of decline. In Mongolia, Dzeren remain woven into the cultural fabric of the steppe. They appear in oral histories and local ecological knowledge. Herders track their movements. Researchers collaborate with pastoral communities to understand migration routes. Conservation efforts increasingly recognize that protecting wildlife corridors must involve the people who share the land. Similarly, on the Tibetan Plateau and around Qinghai Lake, conservation programs for Procapra operate within lived landscapes, among communities whose livelihoods depend on the same grasses and waters. The story then is not one of ancient harmony, shattered overnight. It is a gradual shift from shared movement to structural constraint, from adaptive coexistence to fixed boundaries. Imagine again the storm. Wind drives snow across open steppe. A mounted rider leans low over his horse's neck. Ahead, a pale mass of antelopes moves like smoke along the horizon. In the 12th century, both rider and herd could respond to the storm in the same way, by moving. Today, the storm still comes. Winters still test endurance, but the pathways available to the herd are no longer defined solely by wind and topography. Some remain open, others are narrowed, a few are closed. The lineage of Procapra has endured ice ages, drought cycles, and empires. Their biology is tuned to volatility. Their survival strategy is motion. The question that remains is not whether they can withstand the storm, it is whether the land will allow them to outrun it. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the Antelopes of Procapra. If you're interested in the research behind this episode, you can find a document with image credits and sources in the description below. These videos take a great deal of time to research and produce. They will always remain free to watch. But if you would like to support the channel and gain access to new videos a little earlier, you can find a link to my Patreon below as well. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and keep learning. There's still so much to discover about the world's rare and remarkable species, and the more we understand, the better our chances of protecting them. Thanks for watching.